But we try to take this risk-based approach to our research, and risk is basically, defined by both by the climate hazards, but also understanding exposure, vulnerability, and our ability to respond to different climate hazards. And so we also have recently been focusing on both understanding vulnerability and exposure to climate hazards, in particular in agricultural systems and in public health, but also we have some work on energy systems as well. And more recently, I've been also doing some work in collaboration with my colleagues in anthropology and in public health to understand what are the factors that affect the ability or the capacity of people to manage the types of risks that they are experiencing. And so, some of our work, some of the work in my research group is on global scales, but some of the work that we've been doing is motivated by our understanding of, where populations are more vulnerable. So this is vulnerability is defined by many different factors, but food insecurity is one factor that can make us more vulnerable to climate hazards. So this is a map from FAO that shows food insecurity on a global scale, and there are areas, particularly in Central and Eastern Africa, as well as West Africa, where there's severe to moderate levels of food insecurity. Many communities are experiencing that. About 60% of Africa's population is experiencing food insecurity. And then water insecurity is another factor that can affect our vulnerability. And there are regions in the world, in Africa, South Asia, East Asia, that are extremely water stressed currently. This is without climate change. This is present climate conditions where close to 700 million children are exposed to high levels of water insecurity. And so these factors are, they make communities in these regions more vulnerable to climate change. And climate change is contributing to hazards that are increasing in these regions. So for example, some of the work that we have done is around heat extremes. So these maps show the climatology of temperature, of dry heat and humid heat. Humid heat is basically a combination of temperature and humidity. And areas in red are areas where the extremes in these conditions are at high levels. These are the close to 45, 50 degrees in temperature on the left side, and these are humid heat extremes. And these are, again, as you might be able to see from the maps that I just showed, that the levels of humid heat and dry heat extremes are high in some of those regions that we showed have food and water insecurities. And when we look at where these extremes are changing, we looked at the last 40 years of data and basically found that there are areas where these levels of temperature extremes are already high, are areas where we're seeing some of the strongest trends in both dry and humid heat extremes. So you might recognize some of these areas from the maps that I've shown here earlier. And so our work is sort of focused on understanding better understanding these hazards. Even though we look at a broader global picture here, we're interested in more recently in understanding how these extremes are affecting communities here in parts of Africa, as well as in parts of South Asia. And climate change is certainly contributing to some of these trends, but we also have natural climate variability that contributes to different hazards in regions, right? So you probably have heard of El Nino Southern Oscillation. And so El Nino is a driver of climate variability in most parts, in many parts of the world, in particular in these tropical areas that I just showed as highlighted as having high vulnerability. And so a quick question here, which ENSO phase do you think is associated with higher levels of heat extremes? Is it El Nino or La Nina? So if it's an El Nino, raise your hand. La Nina? That's a good point. But overall, if we look, if we look at like heat extremes, actually, does everybody know ENSO? Would imagine in, yes, no. So, well, El Nino Southern Oscillation is basically oscillations in sea surface temperatures in the Pacific, in the tropical Pacific, that can have impacts on various regions. It influences climate variability, year to year, season to seasonal climate variability in many different regions. And so when we look at, how our exposure, global population exposure to those heat extremes that I showed on the previous maps, how those vary in time, some of the regions that, or some of the years that experience the highest levels of heat extremes. Okay, I think I might have lost some of my animations here, but if you look at population exposure to those heat extremes, both for dry heat and for humid heat, there are a few years that pop out as having extremely high population exposure. And these are years where these are typically associated with El Nino. So those of you that raised your hands for the first question, good job. And so El Nino is also a driver of, so it's a driver of heat extremes. It does matter which region you're talking about for sure, but on a global scale, generally, years that are El Nino events tend to be hotter, and consequently, the heat extremes during those years are also at higher levels. El Nino is also a driver of climate variability, of rainfall variability in the tropics. In particular, if you look at all these regions that are colored in brown, those are areas where precipitation is typically lower during El Nino years. And so that you can see during El Nino, Southeast Asia, parts of South Asia, parts of West and East Africa, and parts of South America all experience relatively dry conditions compared to normal. During La Nina, we see many of these regions experiencing the opposite. We see generally wetter conditions, but there are parts of East Africa as well as Central Africa that experience droughts during La Nina conditions as well. So both, El Nino and La Nina are associated with precipitation variability, but which regions are experiencing droughts depend on what phase of ENSO we're talking about. And recently, these ENSO-driven hydroclimate extremes have had major impacts on human lives and livestock, as well as on infrastructure in many regions. So some of my work recently has focused on East Africa, and I'll be talking about this later. And this is primarily motivated by these recent extreme events that have affected the region. So from 2020 to 2023, there was a prolonged drought. In fact, the worst drought that's affected East Africa, where 30 million people were facing food insecurity because of the drought. And over 13 million livestock died during this drought. And this was as a consequence of 6 consecutive failed rainy seasons. And this was, as I mentioned, is one of the most severe droughts to have affected the region, and and there have been studies to attribute this to human activities. But this was, a drought that was sort of to some extent attributed to La Nina conditions. And the year following that, so following the several failed rainy seasons, the region was hit by extremely heavy precipitation. So you all might remember we went from a 3-year La Nina to an El Nino, and that contributed to extremely heavy rainfall in the region, and that was that also had impacts on communities in addition to the increase in waterborne diseases. There were many communities that were completely cut off because roads and infrastructure was damaged. And so this region has experienced this kind of whiplash from dry conditions to extremely wet conditions, and these are impacting communities in the region. And some of our research has shown that in El Nino, which is El Ninos and La Ninas, the extremes in ENSO, are projected to increase with warming. So if we look at a climate in the future with increased greenhouse gas emissions, we are expected to see, well, I guess it's still a topic of debate in the climate community whether El Nino is going to intensify or not. But some of the work that we've done using the community Earth system model shows that we might see more of these extreme El Nino and extreme La Nina events. And as a consequence of that, we're likely to see more of those droughts occur in the future. And this is both because of more extreme El Nino events, but also the broader hydroclimate changes that we're seeing, that we're expected to see with additional warming. And so our study basically showed that, in a climate with if we continue with, or I guess in a high emission scenario, we're expected to see an increase of about 70% in El Nino driven droughts, and which basically means that El Ninos are likely, because they're going to be stronger and because of the hydroclimate changes, they're more likely to produce droughts in the future than they are right now. I guess that's a simple way to say that. Yeah. And we also looked at how population exposure to droughts are expected to change, and agricultural exposure to droughts are expected to change. And so we've looked here at the total exposure to droughts in the future because of El Nino and La Nina driven droughts. If we look at the near term, that's the next 30 years, we see about a 3 to 4 times increase in the amount of region, the croplands or pastures that are exposed to droughts simultaneously. And so this suggests that we sort of need to understand how these hydroclimate extremes are affecting communities. And I just wanted to highlight here, and I'll get back to this later in my presentation, that pastoralist in particular are really important because of some of the work that I'm going to show in a little bit. And here we see an increase in exposure of pastures as well as agricultural areas to droughts in the future with additional warming. And the IPCC also projects an increase in extreme precipitation events. So heavy rainfall is also projected to intensify. So those extremes that we saw of like severe drought and the whiplash from severe drought to heavy precipitation is also likely a scenario that we can expect to see with additional warming and hydroclimate changes in the region. So one of the things that we're interested in, I mean, these changes have a number of different impacts, but what we're interested in is understanding the health impacts of communities. So I'm curious, I guess, from you all to hear from you all, what do you think are health impacts that these droughts, extreme heat, and extreme precipitation can have? How do you think they can impact communities, the health of communities?
Bacteria and insects would move north into communities and areas that are not immune to them.
Mm-hmm. So increase in the geographic area of disease, yeah. Other ways that these changes can affect our health? Yeah.
I wonder if people who are sensitive to heat might have more heart attacks, for example.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so like cardiovascular impacts in the cardiovascular system. Yeah, go ahead.
Increased infections due to decreased water access for like cleaning out like nerves and infections.
Yeah. So this is actually a figure from the CDC that shows the different ways in which changing climate conditions can impact our health. And they are way more than I had actually envisioned before starting this research. So it's everything from changes in air quality to changes in vector ecology, changes in increased incidence of certain types of disease vectors, environmental degradation, water, as you were mentioning, water impacts on water quality and quantity. And so there are a number of ways in which these impacts can also have addition. So this is again from the CDC, a number of different health impacts that are associated with this. And we have some sense of how these extreme events are impacting these different diseases, but the research on this topic is actually pretty limited. And so we are trying to do some work in addressing this. So we've started some work in particular here on this topic of changes of how climate extremes are affecting certain vector-borne diseases. And in particular, we're focusing on Rift Valley fever. So I've been working with some colleagues who are part of the WSU Global Health team in Kenya. And Rift Valley fever is a really important disease that they have been studying for several years now. And so we did this recent study. I wanted to share some results from this recent study that we did on understanding how climate changes in climate conditions are impacting the epidemiology of Rift Valley fever. So Rift Valley fever is a disease, it's a vector-borne disease that originated in Kenya actually in 1931. And since then, it's sort of spread to sub-Saharan Africa as well as to the Middle East. And it's a disease that is the way that it sort of starts, it starts amongst livestock, but it gets transferred to humans through human animal interactions, and it sort of circulates within the human environment system. And during periods of heavy rainfall, the disease vectors can get amplified and can result in epidemics. And there have been several epidemics that have happened, like RVF epidemics that have happened since 1931. But recently, my colleagues who are studying this disease have noticed that there are changes in where these diseases are occurring. And they were sort of interested in understanding how climate change is impacting that. So just a little bit of background on Rift Valley fever. So the reason it's really important for communities in this region are because it results in livestock mortality. It can also result in high abortion rates in livestock. And it's something that is that really severely can impact livestock in the region, but it also can transfer to humans. In humans, the cases of mortality are low, but it can result in sort of dizziness, as well as encephalitis, as well as hemorrhagic fever. Those are the symptoms, the key symptoms that the disease has amongst human populations. And so the disease historically has occurred in lowland regions where there's dense vegetation, and regions that tend to get heavy rainfall during certain parts of the rainy season. But this map here shows clusters of RVF. So this is just to orient you. This is Kenya and this is Uganda, and these are the two countries for which we are analyzing this data. So we looked at RVF data for like small clusters of these, not epidemics, but small clusters of these diseases that have been observed from 2008 to 2020. And there's for each cluster, there's on average, about 3 animals and 3 humans that were impacted. And so we looked at we got these data from like various different sources. My colleagues actually collected this data. And Kenya is a region where the disease is endemic to Kenya, whereas in Uganda, until recently, they have not observed cases of RVF in Uganda. I think the first case of RVF that they observed was in 2016. So it's a pretty recent disease there. And part of it can be related to, movement of animals, but it can also be related to movement of the disease vectors as well. And so typically, in terms of sort of understanding where these RVF outbreaks happen, they tend to occur near areas, where there are intensive livestock production systems. Historically, they were occurring in more lowland regions, but about 67% of the clusters that we analyzed were in higher altitude regions, particularly in Uganda. They were mostly in high altitude regions. And most of them, unsurprisingly, because water is an important source of vector, a place where vectors can thrive. 72% of these clusters of RVF were in areas where there was either natural or man-made water pools. And this is a distinct seasonality to RVF. So you can, there's the highest number. So for all the clusters that we observed from 2008 to 2022, this is basically showing when in the year those RVF clusters occurred. And the region has 2 distinct rainy seasons. So they have the long rain season, which is March through May, and a short rain season, which is October through December. And so the highest number of these clusters were observed actually following the long rain season. So May, June, July is when we saw the highest number of these RBF clusters. And we also noticed that, so we did some statistical analysis to sort of understand how precipitation as well as vegetation conditions and temperature can impact RBF. And so the kind of key message from those analyses was that when there's a higher likelihood of RBF incidence following precipitation, which results in an increase in vegetation. And that's sort of an important condition for I guess the disease vectors to grow. And so there's 79% increase in this RBF incidence ratio following a month after higher NDVI, or which is basically a measure of vegetation, was observed. And also an increase in temperature. So warmer temperature conditions can also increase the incidence of RBF. So we looked broadly at how climate conditions are changing, and we looked at those two seasons I mentioned, the long rain season and the short rain season. During both these seasons, there has been warming. So this is basically seasonal average temperature, and these two graphs show the average temperatures, and these other two plots show trends in temperature. So this is so essentially, we're seeing an increase in seasonal temperature in both the long rain and the short rain season. And these dots basically represent where those changes are significant. And then we also looked at precipitation, given how important it is for vegetation growth, as well as for just kind of for creating conditions that are conducive to the spread of this disease. And we found that historically, there has been an increase in precipitation in some of these areas that already get high levels of precipitation. So we're seeing all these areas in green are areas where there has been an increasing trend in precipitation. This is the long rain season. Here, we see an increase in precipitation, as well as in the short rain season, we also see an increase in precipitation, but there is an area in Uganda where these clusters were observed, where there is actually a decline in precipitation in the short rain season. And so if we look annually at these trends, and we sort of put the clusters out here, so these dots, these yellow dots represent where those RBF clusters were found. So this is one area here in Uganda, in southwestern Uganda, and then this is a second cluster in southwestern Kenya. And we see that in this region where there's been a recent increase in RBF clusters, and prior to 2016, as I mentioned, we were not seeing these kind of clusters of RBF. If we compare these two regions, this is a region where typically that's where RBF outbreaks were happening. This is a region where there has been an increase in precipitation, whereas over here, where the disease is emerging, is where there's been actually a decline in precipitation in that region. And there's been a decline in precipitation, but also a trend towards fewer rainy days. And that's what's shown on the right side here. This is the total number of dry days, which is days without precipitation. Blue areas are areas where there are fewer dry days, which means there are more rainy days. So there are more rainy days, but less amount of precipitation falling during those days. And there's an opposite trend in the areas where, historically the disease was more endemic. And so there is this question now, we've done this analysis of where, how these climate conditions in these regions are changing, but we still want to understand how are these diverging climate conditions contributing to the changing geography of this disease, which is something that we're still working on. There's not a whole lot of data. As I mentioned, there was only about 100 clusters of RBF that were available. And we don't really have longer term data to go back, but we're trying to collect those sources of information and trying to do some more analysis to relate these changes in climate conditions to where the disease is starting to emerge. But climate is not the only factor. There are also various other factors that are contributing to this. So this is just one of the factors that's there. But going back to these two extreme events that I mentioned here, the drought that happened in East Africa, as well as the flooding in East Africa, the communities that were most impacted by this, as well as the communities that are have the highest exposure to RVF are pastoral communities in this region, right? So pastoralists, both because of their kind of close interaction with livestock, are exposed to RVF as well as other climate-sensitive diseases. They're also they were, according to the UN, were the community that were most vulnerable to these hydroclimate extremes that affected the region. And pastoralism is a really important form of livelihood, a source of livelihood, as well as a source of food and nutrition in these regions. So this is just a map this is just a map showing like where different pastoral communities are located. So you can see there's a high density of pastoral communities here in East Africa, kind of all over, but like I think there's the highest concentration here. I think there are about 250 million pastoralists in Africa. That's the estimate. And so we are interested in we're just starting out a project right now to understand, better get a sense of what are the different health risks that pastoralists in East Africa are experiencing from these hydroclimate extremes, in particular following the events that we saw. There are certain diseases that communities have already that my colleagues have already been studying, but there are also additional health impacts that they recognize that these communities might be experiencing. And so we're like literally just like this week, we have a project that's getting started to work with a community in East Africa, in Kenya, to understand this at a more community level, and also to understand how are these communities managing these risks that they're experiencing. And so I should note that this is a collaboration with two anthropologists and epidemiologists and doctors that are that work in the region. And so the two main questions we're trying to get at is how are these hydroclimate extremes affecting the health of communities, and how are these communities coping and adapting to climate hazards? And hopefully I've convinced you by now that looking at the health of communities is we cannot look at just human health without understanding how animal health is impacted, right? And so there's this is a term I was recently introduced to, which is a One Health approach, which is basically that the health of humans is closely tied to the environment as well as to the health of animals, because especially for pastoral communities, because of their exposure to the environment as well as to animals, we need to take the sort of comprehensive approach to understanding the health risks that they might be facing. And so that's what we're trying to do in this project. And the community that we're working with is they're the Rendile people. These are a nomadic pastoralist community in northern Kenya. Are any of you familiar with the region? Sure. So can you guess like which animals are most like common amongst the herds of pastoralists? Camels, yes. Camels are in fact the Rendile people. They have very large camel herds, but this is just a video from the watering point of where all the pastoralists bring their animals, and you can see that there are actually a lot of different animals there, right? So there's goats, sheep, camel, very large camel herds. It was and yes, there's also I think donkeys that are part of their herds, and so this is the community that we're starting this project with. My colleagues have already been working with this community for a while to understand, to help them like manage some of the diseases that their animals are facing already, like brucellosis, MERS, COVID, and RVF, which I just talked about. And so we're conducting basically, we're conducting interviews with different members of the community to better understand these health risks. So we're doing a combination of things. This is a pilot project, so we're sort of trying to get at different sources of information. So we're starting with, we did some pilot surveys with with the elders of the community. So people that have been, herders for at least 30, 40 years. And this is the team, some of the team of the people that were part of this project. So we're doing like some semi-structured interviews with elders. And then we also decided to understand that, health risks, they're going to be impacted by age, by gender, by mobility, whether you're staying at the homestead, whether you're traveling with your herds. And so we've divided our surveys into two groups. So we're interviewing a set of people that mostly women that tend to stay at the homestead, and they're the main caretakers for their children. And so we're doing these interviews with people that stay, and then we're doing another set of interviews with people that I guess we're calling it go interviews and stay interviews. So people that go to the fora with their animals. And these, we're sort of trying to interview people of different ages. In particular, you can see these people here who are like between the ages of 15 to 26. They are the main caretakers of their animals. And so we're sort of trying to get, different age groups and different members of the community because they experience different types of health risks. And then when we were there, so from our pilot interviews, we learned about the role of like various different organizations in helping address different aspects of climate hazards and climate change. So there's the IGAD or the ICPAC, which is the Climate Prediction and Application Center, which is helping make seasonal forecasts and predictions that they communicate to the communities, and they have been effective in helping provide early warnings to the communities, and especially when there were flash flooding events. For example, they were able to communicate that to communities, but as you might imagine, it was more challenging for to do it for the people that for the herders and for the people that are traveling out in the fora with their herds, because those people don't have they don't well, it's harder to access because they're sort of in the forest, in remote areas, and they don't have access to or regular access to telephones. But for the people that are in the homestead, they're able to provide early warnings to them. And then there's a World Food Program and Concern, which are helping with food, nutrition, and education. And then NDMA, which is the National Drought Management Authority, which in addition to like drought monitoring and forecasting, also has programs that help these communities be more resilient. So they're actually supporting children in the region for like programs to make sure that they're going to schools and getting food and nutrition supplements. And so there's kind of a lot of different organizations in the area that are helping some way in building climate resilience. And so we're also trying to do interviews with them to sort of get a better sense for what they're doing in terms of this, and also what are their experiences with health risks that they're seeing. In terms of the risks that we're trying to get at, so there's of course physical health, as you mentioned, cardiovascular issues that some of them experience, but also mental health has emerged as a very important indicator of an important health stressor. Especially the people that travel to the foras, that they travel with their herds, are experiencing stress and anxiety. And so we're sort of trying to get more data about all these different health risks. And in terms of strategies for adaptation, we're sort of trying to see how are communities adapting. There are various different adaptation strategies, from risk pooling to diversification of livelihood and diversification of food sources, to changes in mobility patterns. And so we're trying to understand what are the different strategies people are using, how are they learning these strategies, and whether these strategies are community-led or whether they're sort of top-down, being brought in by organizations and governments. And this is, I'm not going to walk you through all of this, but this is from our pilot surveys. We sort of created this map of the different risks that we heard from both from women, from who stay in the homestead, and then the people that travel with their herds. So this is a map of like all the different types of stresses we heard about and the health risks that they experience from disease, mental health risks, as well as the cultural health risks that people are experiencing. But our hope is that with the surveys, which are getting started this week, that we'll be able to gather more data on these different health risks to get a better sense for where we should target adaptation strategies, and also how effective the strategies are that are already in place, because there are so many organizations that are already working. And so, yeah. So with that, I just wanted to acknowledge the team of people that helped make the survey happen, or who are making it happen right now, and also acknowledge funding from WSU, which provided us a seed grant to do this work, as well as NIH, which is supporting my colleagues in Kenya. They're running an epidemic and pandemic center there. So yeah, I just wanted to acknowledge that, and I'm happy to take any questions or any feedback.